Palace Thief, Section 6. Yet, perhaps because of this disappointment, I could see in Mr. Woodbridge's eyes, it somehow seemed that I was the one who had failed the boy, and as soon as the auditorium was empty, I left for his room. There, I found him seated on the bed, still in his toga, gazing out the small window to the lacrosse fields. I could see the sheets of my outline pressed against the inside of his garment. "Well, young man," I said, knocking on the door frame, "that certainly was an interesting performance." He turned around from the window and looked at me coldly. What he did next I have thought about many times over the years, the labyrinthine willingness of it, and I can only attribute the precociousness of his maneuvering to the bitter education he must have received at home. As I stood before him in the doorway, Cedric Bell reached inside his cloak and one at a time lifted out the pages of my outline. I stepped inside and closed the door. Every teacher knows a score of boys who do their best to be expelled. This is a cliché in a school like ours, but as soon as I closed the door to his room and he acknowledged the act with a feline smile, I knew that this was not Cedric Bell's intention at all. "I knew you saw," he said. "Yes, you are correct." "How come you didn't say anything, Mr. Hunder?" "It's a complicated matter, Sedgwick." "It's because my pop was there. It had nothing to do with your father." "Sure, Mr. Hunder." Frankly, I was at my wit's end. First, from what Mr. Woodbridge had said to me in the theater, and now from the audacity of the boy's accusation. I myself went to the window then and let my eyes wander over the campus so that they would not have to engage the dark, accusatory gaze of Cedric Bell. What transpires in an act of omission like the one I had committed? I do not blame Mr. Woodbridge, of course, any more than a soldier can blame his captain. What had happened was that instead of enforcing my own code of morals, I had allowed Cedric Bell to sweep me summarily into his. I did not know at the time what an act of corruption I had committed, although what is especially chilling to me is that I believe that Cedric Bell, even at the age of 13, did. He knew also, of course, that I would not pursue the matter, although I spent the ensuing several days contemplating a disciplinary action. Each time I summoned my resolve to submit the boy's name to the honor committee, however, my conviction waned, for at these times I seemed to myself to be nothing more than one criminal turning in another. I fought this battle constantly, in my simple rooms, at the long chip table I governed in the dining hall, and at the dusty chalkboard before my classes. I felt like an exhausted swimmer trying to climb a slippery wall out of the sea. Furthermore, I was alone in my predicament, for among a boarding school faculty, which is as perilous as a medieval court, one does not publicly discuss a boy's misdeeds. This is true even if the boy is not the son of a senator. In fact, the only teacher I decided to trust with my situation was Charles Ellerby, our new Latin instructor, and a kindred lover of antiquity. I had liked Charles Ellerby as soon as we had met because he was a moralist of no uncertain terms, and indeed when I confided in him about Cedric Bell's behavior and Mr. Woodbridge's response, he suggested that it was my duty to circumvent our headmaster and speak directly to the boy's father. Of course, this made sense to me, even if I knew it would be difficult to do. I decided to speak to Senator Bell again. Less than a week after I had begun to marshal my resolve, however, the senator himself had called me. He proffered a few moments of small talk, asked about the gun he had given me, and then said gruffly, "Young man, my son tells me the Hannibal Barca question was not on the list he had to know." Now, indeed, I was shocked. Even from young Cedric Bell, I had not expected this audacity. "How deeply the viper is a viper," I said before I could help myself. "Excuse me?" "The Phoenician general was Hamilcar Barca, sir, not Hannibal." The senator paused. "My son tells me you asked him a question that was not on the list, which the Oriental fellow knew the answer to in advance. He feels you've been unfair, is all." "It's a complex situation, sir," I said. I marshaled my will again by imagining what Charles Ellerby would do in this situation. However, no sooner had I resolved to confront this senator than it became perfectly clear to me that I lacked the character to do so. I believe this had long been clear to Cedric Bell. I'm sure it is complex, Senator Bell said, but I assure you there are situations more complex. Now, I'm not asking you to correct anything this time, you understand. My son has told me a great deal about you, Mr. Hundert. If I were you, I'd remember that. Yes, sir, I said, although by then I realized he had hung up. And thus young Cedric Bell and I began an uneasy combat that lasted out his days at St. Benedict's. He was a dismal student from that day forward, scratching at the very bottom of a class that was itself a far cry from the glorious yesteryear classes of John Dulles and Henry Stimson. His quizzes were abominations, and his essays were pathetic digressions of those of the boys sitting next to him. He chatted amiably in study hall, smoked cigarettes in the third form linen room, and when called upon in class could be counted on to blink and stutter as if called upon from sleep. But perhaps the glory days of St. Benedict's had already begun their wane, for even then, before the large problems that beset us, no action was taken against the boy. For Charles Ellerby and me, he became a symbol, evidence of the first tendrils of moral rot that seemed to be twining among the posts and timbers of our school. Although we told nobody else of his secret, the boy's dim-witted recalcitrance soon succeeded in alienating all but the other students. His second and third form years passed as ingloriously as his first, and by the outset of his last with us, he had grown to mythic infamy among the faculty members who had known the school in its days of glory. He had grown physically larger as well, and now when I chanced upon him on the campus, he held his ground against my disapproving stare with a dark one of his own. To complicate matters, he had cultivated, despite his boorish character, an impressive popularity among his schoolmates, and it was only through the subtle intervention of several of his teachers that he had failed on 2 occasions to win the presidency of the student body. His stride had become a strut. His favor among the other boys, of course, had its origin in the strength of his physical features, and the precocious evil of his manner, and in the bellowing timbre of his voice. But unfortunately, such crudities are all the more impressive to a group of boys living out of sight of their parents. This is not to say that the faculty of St. Benedict's had given up hope for Cedric Bell. Indeed, a teacher's career is punctuated with difficult students like him, and despite the odds, one could not help but root for his eventual rehabilitation. As did all the other teachers, I held out hope for Cedric Bell and his fits of depravity and intellectual feebleness. I continued to look for glimpses of discipline and progress. By his 4th form year, however, when I had become Dean of Seniors, it was clear that Cedric Bell would not change, at least not while he was at St. Benedict's. Despite his powerful station, he had not even managed to gain admission to the state university. It was with a sense of failure, then, finally, that I handed him his diploma in the spring of 1949, on an erected stage at the north end of the great field on which he came forward, met my disapproving gaze with his own flat one, and trundled off to sit among his friends.